Hi everyone. Traditionally, the Anglo-Saxon invasion has been dated to about the year 449. That's when the Anglo-Saxons are traditionally believed to have arrived in Britain. However, there's good evidence that actually this date is too late by about 2 decades. So there's evidence that the real arrival was in about the year 428. So what's this evidence? Well, to understand, we first need to understand where that traditional date comes from. So it comes from Gildas. He was a 6th century monk, and he described how after the Romans had left Britain, the Britons were facing trouble from the Picts and the Scots, so they appealed to Aetius. The name used by Gildas is actually Aegitius. Now that might be important, although we'll look at that in another video, but he's traditionally identified with Aetius, Flavius Aetius, and Gildas explains that when the Britons appealed to him, they called him thrice consul. So this is generally understood as being an appeal that was sent to Aetius after his 3rd consulship. So that would place it in the final few years of the 440s. However, because there was no favourable response from Aetius, the Britons, under the leadership of King Vortigern, appealed to the Anglo-Saxons to serve as mercenaries to protect them. This worked for a short while, and then they rebelled against the Britons and started conquering parts of what's now England. So that's the basic reason for why the traditional date for the Anglo-Saxon arrival is 449. However, in 2 sources that predate Gildas, we find evidence for a different date. So the first one is the Gallic Chronicle of 452. Now, as the name suggests, this was written in 452, the 5th century, whereas Gildas was writing in the 6th century. There's debate about when exactly he was writing. I place him much later than most, but in any case, he was writing in the 6th century, whereas this chronicle from Gaul, the Gallic Chronicle of 452, predates him. So this is definitely a much more valuable source. Now this chronicle, in the entry for the year 441, it specifically says that Britain, or the British provinces, had fallen into the hands of the Saxons. So that is very, very significant. That demonstrates that in the 5th century, in the middle of the 5th century, the Saxons had already taken over a large part of Britain. Obviously, it wouldn't be right to say that they had literally taken over all of the British provinces, the former Roman British provinces. Archaeology rules that out, as do all the other written sources, but it shows that they had conquered enough of it by the year 441 that someone from Gaul could look at Britain and think, basically, Britain has fallen into the hands of the Saxons. So that proves very clearly that they arrived there and started conquering significantly before the traditional date. They had already conquered a substantial amount of Britain by the beginning of the 440s. Another source from the 5th century which is important is the life of St. Germanus, written by a certain Constantius in the 470s. So it dates to just 2 decades later than this Gallic Chronicle, and in this source we have an account of Germanus, a prominent religious figure from Gaul, going to Britain, and he actually went on 2 trips according to the source. The first was in about the year 430, whereas the second was toward the end of the 440s. Now, in that first visit, he's said to have helped the Britons defeat the Saxons in battle. So this is another source which portrays the Saxons as already in Britain, engaging in warfare with the Britons well before the traditional date of 449. In fact, this places them waging war against the Britons as early as 430. So when we look at this documentary evidence, it's very clear that Gildas is the outlier. He postdates these 2 sources and he contradicts them completely. These 2 near contemporary sources, in fact, the Gallic Chronicle is almost as contemporary as historical sources get. They clearly place the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons prior to the middle of the 5th century. Then we've also got the evidence from archaeology, because archaeology, well, it's not as precise as documentary evidence, but it's still very useful, and the conclusion, the general consensus among archaeologists today, is that we first see Anglo-Saxon material culture in Britain as early as 430. So that again ties in perfectly with these documentary sources from the 5th century. Now, we could just leave it there, because these 3 sources, archaeology, and the near-contemporary Gallic Chronicle of 452 and the also near-contemporary Life of St. Germanus, they clearly point to about 430 as the true date for the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. However, it's also worth looking at British tradition, albeit this is later than Gildas, it's worth taking into account what it says. So first of all, the Historia Brittonum makes the clear statement that Vortigern became king in the year 425. Now, Vortigern was the king who was said to have invited the Anglo-Saxons to Britain in the first place, and then shortly afterwards they rebelled against him. In the 4th year of his reign, which would be the year 428, he invited the Anglo-Saxons over. That's when they arrived. So we see that this British tradition, preserved in the Historia Brittonum, ties in perfectly with the archaeology, the evidence from the Gallic Chronicle, and the evidence from the life of St. Germanus. It conflicts with Gildas, but again we see Gildas is the outlier. Now another example is the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth in the Historia Regum Britanniae. So he explains that in the early part of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, there was the visit to Britain from Germanus and Lupus. Now this is very significant because if you remember, I said that Germanus went to Britain, according to the records. He went to Britain twice. Once was in about 430, the other was in the late 440s. Now there are some scholars who believe that the second visit was actually a duplicate, so it never really happened. It was just a phantom event in the records, mistakenly produced by the writer. However, regardless of whether that's true or not, what's significant is that Lupus is said to have gone to Britain with Germanus in his first visit, not his second. So regardless of whether Germanus really did visit Britain twice or not, Lupus was said to have gone with him in the first visit, in about 430. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth, he places this visit by Germanus and Lupus just after the start of the Anglo-Saxon arrival in Britain. So again, we find this clear evidence from British tradition that they arrived shortly before 430. So we see that it's not a case of continental sources like the Gallic Chronicle and the life of St. Germanus disagreeing with insular sources like Gildas. It's not a case of that at all. It's actually a case of Gildas being the outlier. It's really this account about Aegitius that messes all this up, this identification of him with Flavius Aetius and the placement in Gildas' sequence of events. So rather than insular sources being contradicted by continental sources, it's really basically all the sources contradicting Gildas, aside from obviously the Anglo-Saxon sources which used Gildas as their basis. So when we take the British tradition, independent of Gildas, and the much earlier continental sources, we see that the traditional date should really be about 430, or just before 430. We have in the Historia Brittonum the specific date of 428, which is probably about as close as we can come to a specific traditional date for the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, aside from Gildas's one, which clearly is wrong. Now, if you'd like to know whether or not scholars have finally established who exactly was the real author of the Iliad, then come back next time for my next video.